Fire decks are absolutely dominant this format, and we already know that hand traps are amazing, but what do you do if you want to play board breakers instead? What's motion? You got Matt here, and welcome back to another competitive Yu-Gi-Oh video. Today we're talking about board breakers in the post-Phantom Nightmare high-powered tier 0 fire format, and how good they are against those strategies and all the other strategies surrounding the fire decks. So if you're excited for the video and to find out which board breakers are the best in this format, then make sure to smash the like button. If this video hits 250 likes, I'll bring you a guide to the best side deck cards in this format as well that'll cover the entire meta. Also, if you like competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, including deck profiles, combo guides, meta discussions, and videos just like this one, you're gonna love this channel, so make sure to subscribe. We're on the road to 10,000 subscribers and we can't get there without your help. But with that being said, here is your guide to the best board breakers in the post-Phantom Nightmare competitive Yu-Gi-Oh format. Let's jump into it. As always, I have 6 different categories to place these different cards, and those categories are going to be playable in most main decks, playable in some main decks, playable in most side decks, playable in some side decks, as well as niche and just don't. Niche are going to be for cards that can see play in very few decks in the format, and just don't are for cards that honestly should not be played in this format in almost any circumstance. Now obviously, because of the way we're categorizing these cards, there are going to be some cards that are going to see a lot of play in the main deck and will be therefore higher on the tier list, but are going to be actually worse cards this format than cards that might be seeing play in side decks. It's just because cards in side decks right now and cards in main decks have different categories to what makes them good or bad. Obviously, we're in a tier 0 format with Snake Eye and Fire King being absolutely dominant, and some people might say that it's not tier 0 because we have 2 separate decks in Snake Eye and Fire King, but really it's just the same deck with a bit more Fire King cards or a bit more Snake Eye cards, and that's really it. And if all the pro players are saying that right now is a tier 0 format, I'm not going to disagree with them. So that being said, because it's a tier 0 format, all of these board breakers have to be looked at and how good they're going to be against those strategies, and all these other non-fire decks this format, while they're not going to be as heavily weighted, they're still going to be looked at, just again, not as much. But with that being said, our first card we're going to talk about today is going to be Alpha Master of Beasts. Alpha is a really interesting card this format because it offers removal that doesn't send cards to the graveyard, it doesn't destroy, and it doesn't target either, which is all really nice. But it's not seeing play for 2 reasons. The first of which is that it special summons itself out to the field to be able to activate its effect, which means that your opponent can just chain the effect of Promethean Princess, targeting the Alpha and the Anvil Whale to destroy them both, and that way Alpha doesn't actually resolve to be able to bounce cards back. And the reason why that actually happens is because Alpha is not a quick effect, and that's the other problem with the card. If it was a quick effect, it would see a lot more play in my opinion, because returning cards to the hand without targeting is really good in this format right now. It's just that as a normal ignition effect, it really doesn't have as much utility as we'd want it to have. It's because of these 2 problems that Alpha won't see any play and should be placed in the just don't tier. Book of Eclipse is not a terrible option. I mean, it's not that good either, but it's a fine option for a lot of situations because it stops a lot of the effects your opponent wants to do while preventing them from link climbing as well. A lot of the time, your opponent will try to link off something like a Flamber's Dragon, for example, to get it into the graveyard to be able to then bring back 2 level 1 fire monsters. But if you're using Book of Eclipse to stop that from happening, that can be really good. The same goes for being able to stop something like a Snake Eye Ash or Snake Eye Oak from being able to use their effects to be able to summon from the deck, which is really nice in this situation as well. Is it that impactful? It depends on the situation, but honestly, for a card that doesn't actually remove monsters from the field, I wouldn't be that surprised if I saw a deck playing it. So for those reasons, Book of Eclipse belongs in the niche tier. Book of Lunar Eclipse is just a strictly worse version of the original Book of Eclipse. You discard a card to be able to target 2 monsters, which Book of Eclipse doesn't do, and it only deals with 2 cards. Sure, it can have some utility at some point, but right now, it doesn't make any sense to play. There are just so many better options that do the same thing or something similar, so for that reason, it belongs in the just don't tier. As for Book of Moon, I love this card. It is one of my favorite cards of all time and arguably my favorite card on this list here. But right now, it's not the best card in the world. Sure, some decks want to play it as a way to play around targeted effect negation like Infinite Impermanence or Effect Failure, but that's not every single deck in the format. It's also really nice because you can still use it going first or going second, which has its applications, but like I said, it really doesn't have as much utility as you would like it to. You can use it on the Flamber's Dragon to stop them from linking off with it, which means they can't get their resources back. You can also use it in response to the IP Masquerena effect. If they try to link summon with something like a Flamber's Dragon, you can Book of Moon the Flamber's Dragon. Because it's face down, they can't actually link with it, which means they won't get the effect to be able to summon back the 2 level 1 fire monsters, and they're forced to use the Anvil Whale instead to go into something usually that's going to be something like an SP Little Knight, which means they have no fire monsters on the field to activate the effect of their copy of Promethean Princess in the graveyard. Now, while what I mentioned there is really nice and all, most of the time players are going to choose other cards that are going to have a bit more impact than that. Because some decks played for multiple different reasons, and honestly because I don't think it belongs in the niche tier, I think it makes sense to see play in some side decks. As for Change of Heart and Mind Control, these 2 cards are very interesting as well because this format doesn't have a lot of spell and trap negation. Sure, there are going to be some situations where your opponent has access to an IP Mask Arena and they can just tag out or link off with a targeted monster, or they have access to a Baron de Fleur, which means they can just negate the effect. At least you're forcing out those effects, which is really nice. So for those reasons, Change of Heart and Mind Control belong in the niche tier. Cosmic Cyclone is incredible in this format. Not only is it very good to be able to beat cards like Fire King Island to make their entire board blow up, but it's also really good against the Snake Eye matchup, especially against the IP Mask Arena while it's in the Spell and Trap Zone. And before you comment, while IP is in the Spell and Trap Zone, it is considered to be a face-up continuous spell card, which means you can banish it as well, so they can't summon it back. Just make sure that when you want to use Cosmic Cyclone on the IP Mask Arena, you're doing so in response to the effect of Flamber's Dragon to summon it back to the field. There are also so many other applications. There are great applications against Labyrinth, against Fluanda Rees, against decks like Runic, Manadium for the counter trap, and of course even Voiceless Voice to snipe either of the continuous spells or traps. Cosmic Cyclone is amazing right now, but no one is actually main decking it. So basically it's a card that belongs in most side decks. But even though I have it in most side decks, that doesn't mean it's a worse card than cards that you'll see in higher tiers. Now let's talk about board wipes like Raigeki, Dark Hole, Lightning Storm, and Harpy's Feather Duster. All four of these cards have a lot of utility in this format, but they're not going to be that strong. Let's start off by talking about Dark Hole and Raigeki. Dark Hole or Raigeki into a full Fire King or Snake Eye board just doesn't feel that great. Think of it this way, if your opponent's going to have a Flamber's Dragon on their side of the field, they'll not only get back 2 level 1 fire monsters to get back additional resources, but they'll also have the Anvil Whale trigger to bring back the IP Mask Arena anyways to link off with. So they're getting pretty much all the value they could possibly want. The only thing they're losing out on is maybe a Princess Pop, but honestly, they're still going to have 2 fires on the field, so it doesn't matter too much. As for Lightning Storm, it's really only seeing play as a secondary copy of Harpy's Feather Duster right now, and honestly, considering that Harpy's Feather Duster is a really good card, that's not that bad of an option. But because Cosmic Cyclone is significantly better than all the other back row removal in this format, you have to make a decision. Is playing a copy of Lightning Storm better than maxing out on copies of Cosmic Cyclone? And while Harpy's Feather Duster is also really good, is it going to be better than Cosmic Cyclone in a lot of cases? The answer is probably not. So basically, because of how good Cosmic Cyclone is in this format, it takes away a lot of the utility that Storm and Duster have. So for Dark Hole and Raigeki, I'd put them both in the niche tier. I'd also put Lightning Storm there too, since it's rare to see Duster plus Storm in side decks now. But Duster feels wrong to place in any other tier other than some side decks. Dark Ruler No More is a really bad card right now outside of maybe Manadium, but even then they have the counter trap for it. Honestly, the reason why Dark Ruler is not seeing any play and shouldn't see much play at all is because in this format, a lot of the interruption and negation happens in the graveyard or in the hand in the form of hand traps. Because it's so bad against these fire decks and not impactful enough against the rest of the decks in the format, just don't play Dark Ruler No More. Dinowrestler Pankratops is a really cool card in the format, but it's not always going to be that good. But the reason why I like it so much is because of the interaction it has when it comes to Floodgates. Some of the most popular cards to see in the side deck right now are going to be Floodgates like Anti-Spell Fragrance and Summon Limit, because if you go for a full Snake Eye board, flip up Summon Limit or flip up Anti-Spell, a lot of the time your opponent will just concede. So if the first thing you're doing is summoning Pankratops out to your side of the field and they chain Princess, you can just chain Pankratops, send itself to the graveyard, and then be able to pop a Mystery back row or another monster that they have on the field. It's not a perfect card, but I do think it has a home in some side decks. But you have to really hate Floodgates to play both Cosmic Cyclone and Pankratops in your side deck. Enemy Controller is another option to take control of opponent's monsters, but honestly, it's not that good this format. The best utility it has for me is to dodge cards like Effect Veiler or Infinite Impermanence and take control of an opponent's monster, and even that, it's not that strong because most of the time you're going to end up being in a 2-for-1 situation. In the mirror match, it's pretty cool because you can take Princess or Flamber's Dragon to use their effects, but that's not even that impactful. I'd actually argue that right now it's about the same power level as Change of Heart, so for that reason, I'll put it in the niche tier. Evenly Matched is really interesting this format as well. Obviously, there's not a lot of spell and trap negation, and a lot of the cards in the fire decks really hate being banished. The problem is that if you leave one card for the Snake Eye player, they can go absolutely crazy with it. A lot of the time that one card will let them rebuild their entire board, and while you do get rid of certain resources like possibly Fire King Island, or of course a Princess or a Flamber's Dragon, whatever the case might be, they'll have so much cards in their hand to be able to actually use their effects and rebuild their board pretty effortlessly. They also know that they're not going to be losing the game this turn, so it really doesn't matter too much if they can just rebuild. Right now I think it's good enough to see play in some side decks, but not more than that. Forbidden Chalice is a worse version of Infinite Impermanence. It does not make sense to play it right now at all, so for that reason, just don't play it. Forbidden Droplet, on the other hand, is a really solid option in a lot of different situations because of 2 reasons. The first of which is that it can help dodge effect negation while being able to be negating effects of your opponent's cards as well. And the second reason is that it can get cards from your hand into the graveyard that want to be there. I still think you can find something that's a lot more impactful than Forbidden Droplet, but it is definitely a better version of Chalice, that is for sure. So for now, Forbidden Droplet belongs in the niche tier. Herald of the Abyss is really only good against one deck, and that's Purely. Sure, there are other decks like Raid Raptor that put up a ton of Towers monsters. The problem is, a lot of the time they'll put up other monsters that are Darkwing Beasts as well, so they can just send one of the irrelevant cards to the graveyard instead. Unless you're really worried about Purely exactly, I just wouldn't bother playing Herald of the Abyss. And even then, you can just play copies of Book of Moon instead as a suitable alternative. So in my opinion, just don't play Herald of the Abyss. Kaijus are fine this format. They're nothing special, but they get the job done at least okay. I really like that you can still normal summon after you actually use the Kaiju, but is it really going to be that impactful? The answer is probably not. If you're playing against a Raid Raptor or Purely, sure, you can actually use a Kaiju, but is it going to be that impactful? Again, the answer is no. Purely recycles their resources because it's your card that's causing them to leave the field, and Raid Raptor puts up multiple towers monsters, so one Kaiju is not doing enough for you. I just don't see a world where playing a Kaiju is better than playing other cards, so for that reason, just don't play Kaijus, but again, they are fine cards, just not necessary right now. Lava Golem, in my opinion, is a really solid option, but only against one deck, and that's going to be Raid Raptor. A lot of the time, they can set up multiple towers monsters, and getting rid of them with a Lava Golem is really nice. But against all these fire decks, it does absolutely nothing for you, so what is the point of it really? Strictly because Raid Raptor is gaining popularity and some decks don't care about their normal summon, I'll put it in the niche tier. As for Sphere Mode, all the things I said about Lava Golem go for Sphere Mode as well, but they need one more monster. At the same time though, what decks are really putting up 3 really impactful monsters on the field this format? It's like Vanadium and that's it. Sure, you can use it against fire decks, but they're just going to have Flamber's Dragon trigger, summon back level 1 monsters, and they can just pop off from there, so it doesn't really make too much of a difference. I just don't believe that Sphere Mode is that impactful right now, and while it was close to being in the just don't tier, I'm going to be putting it in niche for now. Soul Release is an amazing card in this format. It is one of the best, if not the best, board breakers against fire decks. It shuts off the majority of their interruptions and of their recovery as well. It is just a fantastic card right now because they can't even really respond to it in general. But it's not really a card that's seeing any play in main decks, it's mostly a card for the side deck. So while it is one of, if not the best board breaker in this format, I can't actually put it in the main deck tiers. So for that reason, Soul Release joins Cosmic Cyclone in the playable in most side decks tier. As for Kashtira Fenrir, I think this card is great this format. In terms of what it can actually do, it is really nice. The problem with it is that your opponent can just activate Princess in response to the special summon. But you can use Fenrir as both a board breaker and as a form of interruption as well. And just a reminder, never use Kashtira Fenrir search effect as your first searching, because if you use that, then they're going to droll you and you're going to lose the game instantly. As long as you don't search with Kashtira Fenrir until droll doesn't matter to you, I would put Fenrir in the playable in some main decks tier. So Kurikara Divincarnate has a lot of applications in this format as a great way to be interrupting a lot of boards. The problem is, it's not that good, but because it has the perfect stat line, it is seeing quite a bit of play right now. It is a level 1 fire monster, which means it is searchable to be able to out a lot of weird and tricky situations in the format today. So pretty much only because it's a level 1 fire monster, it's seeing play in some side decks, but almost exclusively in fire decks. Monster Reborn is a board breaker in this format. Yeah, you heard that right, but only when you're playing in a fire mirror match. The reason why is because you can target your opponent's copy of Princess that's in their graveyard and summon it back to your field. This does a few things for you. Number 1, you can always use its effect to be able to reborn monsters that you have in your graveyard to be able to pop off. But most importantly, you can just go to battle phase and threaten out a copy of IP Masquerena as well, and they're then going to be able to use their copy of SP, for example, to banish their own copy of Princess, which just plays right into your hands. We're actually starting to see Monster Reborn pop up in more main decks a lot more often, but honestly it's really only at its best in the mirror match. So for those reasons, Monster Reborn belongs in the playable in some main decks tier. There is no doubt that Super Polymerization is a good card this format. The problem is that it's not that impactful and it can't be played in most decks right now. There's a lot of really good targets right now, including Mud Dragon of the Swamp for the Amblo Whale and for the copy of Flamber's Dragon. It's also really good to go into something like Earth Golem Ad Ignister, which can then suck up the copies of the IP Masquerena and the Amblo Whale as well. But again, not many decks are playing it, and the reason why is because the fire decks in this format are so dominant, and those decks have very little space for cards in the extra deck other than the ones that are going to be for their engine. But on the other hand, you have decks like Voiceless Voice, which are very good in this format as well, and they don't use the extra deck too much, so having Super Poly is great for them too. It's not a perfect card, but it still is very strong. But because the clear best decks don't really play it, its representation is a lot lower. So for that reason, Super Poly goes in the playable in some side decks tier. Triple Tactics Talent is in an incredible spot in this format. There are so many hand traps in the format today. A lot of the best decks are playing 15 or more hand traps right now, so it's very likely that your talents will be live. We're also seeing a lot fewer board breakers being played as well. I mean, just look at our tier list. There are so few cards sitting in the main deckable tiers, and that is a problem for a lot of different board breakers in the format today. But it means that hand traps are seeing a lot more play, which means talents is going to be always live. Just think about it this way. When you're going first, if you get ashed or whatever, you can then use talents, look at your opponent's hand, and rip out a card that is most important to them. You can also use the draw 2 cards if you really need to, but it's actually at its best though when you're going second because it doesn't target to take an opponent's monster. Personally, I like taking the copy of the Flamber's Dragon because I can force out the effect of IP Masquerena while still threatening battle phase. At the same time though, if they actually use the effect of IP Masquerena in response to the effect of talents to take, you can then take the copy of SP Little Knight, and because it was summoned before the effect of talents resolves, you can actually take the copy of SP Little Knight, and then you're the one that gets to banish a card on the field. Talents is a fantastic option and honestly will be our first and very likely only card in the playable in most main decks tier. Triple Tactics Thrust, on the other hand, is a really cool card, but is not seeing that much play for a few different reasons. One of the reasons why is because a lot of the best side deck cards right now are continuous spells or traps. You can't search for a copy of Summon Limit or Anti-Spell Fragrance, it has to be something else. So while Thrust doesn't work out perfectly as a board breaker all the time, it still is seeing a lot of play for a few different reasons in decks like Fluwandereeze to search for cards like Harpy's Feather Storm, and of course in Branded to search for something like Fusion Duplication in case their Branded Fusion gets ashed. So because Thrust is mostly a side card in fire decks, but because of its role in other decks, it'll be joining the some main decks tier. Twin Twister is a worse version of Cosmic Cyclone. You discard a card, you destroy, it's just not that good right now, so honestly, just don't play it. Ultimate Slayer needs a lot of things to go right for it to see a lot of play. Firstly, you have to be playing a deck that doesn't really use the extra deck that much. It can play the different types of monsters in there as well. It's also hard to justify playing Ultimate Slayer over any of the other board breakers we've spoken about today. So while it is a very strong card, there are just not enough decks that can take advantage of it, but it still belongs in the some side decks tier. And the last card for today is XYZ Encore. This card is not good right now. It's really only good against one deck, and that's Purely, and there are so many other options that are good against it instead, so I just wouldn't bother playing it. So it's pretty clear that you just don't play XYZ Encore. And that is it. My tier list for the best board breakers in the post-Phantom Nightmare competitive Yu-Gi-Oh format is looking like this over here. Now let me know down in the comments below, what do you think about the video itself, and do you see any mistakes on my tier list? I would love for us to have a debate down in the comments. If you made it this far in the video, then you must have enjoyed it, so make sure to smash the like button. Remember, if this video hits 250 likes, I'll bring you a tier list to the best side deck cards in Yu-Gi-Oh today. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter and join the Discord server. Both are linked in the description, and of course subscribe to the channel as well if you haven't already. We're on the road to 10,000 subscribers and we cannot get there without your help. Oh, and one more thing. Today is the official 1-year anniversary of the first ever video on the channel. I want to say to you all, thank you so much for joining us on this amazing adventure so far. This past year has been crazy. We've grown so much faster than I ever expected, and honestly, I've had a great time making content for you all. So guys, thank you so much for being part of this journey. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.